starting Climate Prep Week events. We are, as people are trickling in, some may be off mute. Yes, if you stay with mics off just as we get started the event. But yeah, welcome to Heat Impacts in Boston, Extreme Heat Impacts in Boston, one of our Climate Prep Week events. My name is Colin Battis. I'm a program coordinator at CREW, working with communities responding to extreme weather, and I have been here for over a year. And we're joined tonight by Dr. Madeline Scammell and Bianca Bowman, both of whom have been working with the Sea Heat project hosted by GreenRoots Chelsea for the past several years. And I'll let them introduce themselves in just a sec, but we're really excited that they're both able to join us and share some of their work for these past several years, looking at the impacts of extreme heat in Boston, considering how it's affecting different parts of the city. I'd like to turn it over first to Bianca to introduce yourself, and then you can pass it on to Madeline.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here today. Thank you to CREW for putting this together. My name is Bianca Bowman. I am the climate justice organizer with GreenRoots, a small nonprofit organization in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And I mostly work on climate-focused projects, including extreme heat and other climate mitigation, such as flood mitigation. So extremely happy to be here. And I'll pass it to Madeline.
Thanks, Bianca, and thanks, Colin, and thanks, Vernon Walker, and all the Vernon Walkers out there for coming. I'm Madeline Scammell. I'm on the faculty at Boston University School of Public Health. I'm an environmental scientist. I study things in the environment that affect human health. And I'm a resident of Chelsea and have worked with GreenRoots since its founding. And with its staff for many years on a number of environmental justice issues. Yeah.
Awesome. We're so glad to have both of you here, and we'll learn a lot more about your work, respectively, in a minute or two. As we're getting started, everyone, you're welcome.
Send them away.
We're welcome to put questions in the chat as we're going along and discussing. Also, so we'll be reading those out. And also, as we're getting towards the later in the event, we'll have a Q&A section, and we'd love to hear you come off mic as well then too. It may be easier with so many people attending right now, have questions in the chat to start out, but you'll have a chance to talk later on too. Before we jump into learning about the work that Bianca and Dr. Scammell have been working on, I'd like to quickly we're all here together to talk about extreme heat in Boston and the impacts that it can have on human beings. CREW is focused on responding and preparing people to develop resilience to extreme weather and climate disaster. And over the past couple of years, we had the opportunity to work throughout the summers on AC distributions and giveaways, giving away cooling kits and holding educational workshops about the effects of extreme heat. Which is a serious issue that is growing to grow more intense in Boston in the coming years, thanks to the impacts of climate change, unfortunately. I'd like to share a quick presentation, I won't keep you too long, about some of the information that CREW likes to share with our audiences that are different summer events and educational programming, just about why extreme heat is a threat in Boston, even such as a northerly city as ours, and why it's important to be increasingly aware of it moving forward. So I'll share my screen here. So yeah, CREW has worked for the past several years on preparing people for extreme heat, particularly in neighborhoods of Boston that are urban heat islands. We'll get to that in a second. Just to start out here, we see here, this is a projection of warming weather in Boston over the next decades, what we're likely to see. We've had a baseline of only a couple of days of extreme weather, about 11 days of extreme weather throughout the year, that's the average climate of Boston in the past. Right now, we are seeing an increase in the number of days that are above 90 degrees going up. It used to be quite rare, like less than half the summer we'd see that. Now in the summers, this is the average for 2030, and we're getting close to this already. Actually, we're a bit ahead of schedule for this number. We're seeing about 30 days in the summer above 90 degrees, and a couple of that are above 100. By 2070, on average, we're expecting to have over 2 months of days that we classify as having extreme heat throughout the city of Boston. Some of those being well above 100 degrees, which has been unheard of in the city for most of its history, which means a lot of our buildings aren't set up to, and we don't have the AC, don't have the insulation to deal with extreme heat like we do with the cold. We're seeing that right now, the estimation is that with a lower degree of emissions, a lower degree of warming than we're currently expecting, Massachusetts is going to be about as warm as Maryland is on average throughout the year by 2070. And what we're looking at more likely for a higher emission scenario, we're expecting to be, how about the climate of Georgia or North Carolina by 2070, by the 2070s, resembling states in the US South. And also the extreme heat that we're anticipating and that is already affecting the city is not equally distributed. This is a heat map of Boston today, just based on, I think it was 2 years ago, this data was taken. And you can see there's areas of the city that are bright red, orange, or blue. And generally, these patterns of heat, explanatory, the redder it is, the hotter it is, maps pretty accurately onto where the trees are in the city, where the city is less dense. And some of the most intensely hot neighborhoods in Boston are also some of those that have the lowest incomes, the least economic investment. This is something that results from the urban heat island effect. There's areas of cities that experience a lot higher temperatures than other areas. Buildings and roads, more concrete and fewer green spaces, all mean that there's more heat and temperature absorbed by that concrete and then reflected back into the air, making the area hotter than if there was more green space, more trees in the region. Typically, the heat island exposure is much greater in areas of the city where it's harder to come across parks and trees and walkable areas. And also heat waves are, we see a lot more deaths, there's a lot more severe impacts on public health from these heat waves that we're going to be increasingly seeing in Boston summers. But also there's typical effects like heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke, which can be increasingly deadly, especially in the elderly, young people, folks who are working outside or just exposed to more hot temperatures that don't have ACs. But we also see there's a lot of psychological effects of extreme heat. We have typically, with a case of Hurricane Katrina, which was not an incident of extreme heat, though there was loss of power in the city, resulting in a lot of people exposed to high temperatures for long periods of time. But typically, there's a pretty direct correlation between natural disaster or just exposure to extreme weather and developing anxiety or mood disorders. As a pretty severe example, outside of the US, in the past 30 years, there's about 60,000 suicides that are directly attributed to climate change and directly to increased heat waves causing the loss of crops, more strain from heat waves. Generally, both directly through heat-related conditions, people who are getting taken into hospitals for heat stroke, heat exhaustion, as well as indirectly, there's just a broad across the board increase in people going to the emergency room and people going into psychiatric wards whenever there's periods of extreme heat. And also there's the effect of climate change in general, but also extreme heat in particular, results as people are affected by increased incidents of extreme weather. They lose community connections. People lose a connection to their neighborhood or their community, resulting in weaker social bonds, people not being as able to rely on community institutions for places to go to get out of the heat or to find resources they might need. And in general, the effects of all of this is seen a lot more severely among people who have existing health conditions, the elderly, people who are working outside or who are exercising outside in the heat, as well as children and people who are pregnant. All right, I talked for a little bit I monologued for a while. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to our guests here to let them talk a bit about their work, both Bianca and Dr. Scammell. So the first thing that I want to ask both of you is, I gave kind of a general overview there of extreme heat, the broad effects it can have, why we could be concerned about it in Boston. But I'm interested in your perspective, both of you, on sort of what you are concerned about with extreme heat, what you expect in Boston as the future of Boston, and why you see it as significant, something that you're worried about.
Thank you. Bianca, should I go first or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And Colin, please feel free to call me Madeline.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah, I think my focus on heat began about 10 years ago when I started studying an epidemic of chronic kidney disease in Central America. Chronic kidney disease is the leading cause of death among working age men in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And it's extremely common, and unfortunately, it does lead to death because of many reasons, including the healthcare system. But heat appears to be one of the primary risk factors. So exposure to extreme heat and physical activity in the workplace. And so I've started measuring heat among these workers and thinking about it in the context of climate change and extreme heat events up here. And then I'm part of a Center for Climate and Health in my school that launched officially very recently. It's led by Greg Wallenius, who's also in the Environmental Health Department. And he and his colleagues, my colleagues, they've been looking at health effects of heat, extreme heat events, and seasonal effects on health. For the last couple of years, they've published some really interesting studies using health insurance claims nationally. So these are people who have health insurance, but they live all over the country. And they see temperature associated with emergency department visits, as you said, Colin, in your introduction, for almost any cause, including renal disease, heat-related illness, of course, and mental health disorders, as you said. But these are highest, the risk is highest in the Northeast for some of these findings. And among men and young and middle-aged adults. So we know who's most vulnerable to extreme heat, but no one is immune to the adverse effects of extreme heat. And this same group looking at health insurance claims did a closer examination of mental health disorders and found, again, substance use disorders, anxiety and stress-related disorders, mood, schizophrenia, and delusional disorders, as well as self-harm, all were associated with seasonal changes and high temperature months. And again, in the Northeast, people are at great risk of this. So what they hypothesize is that this is related to a lesser degree of heat adaptation in the Northeast, particularly in cities that are not accustomed to such extreme heat events. And we've seen more extreme heat events in the last summer than in the prior summers. It seems like every season we're breaking records. What they didn't see are hospitalizations or emergency department visits due to cardiovascular or respiratory disease, which may seem surprising, but these are also people with health insurance who make it to the emergency department. And there have been studies indicating that people who die from heat of cardiovascular outcomes don't make it to the ED. They die at home. So the deaths estimated to be caused by extreme heat have ranged from in the hundreds per year to now in the thousands, like 6,000 or 7,000 people die as a result of exposure to extreme heat. And I think as a researcher, we're really we're not seeing the whole picture. We haven't for quite some time, and now there's more attention being paid to that. And I will just add to the list of adverse outcomes associated with extreme heat exposure, research by our colleagues in the Department of Epidemiology looking at reproductive health, risk of spontaneous abortion, early miscarriage, also associated with season, and in August in the South and Midwest, where the temperature is hottest during the summer, the risk goes up by 44%. So there are a number of reasons why that may be, but I think that we need to prepare to prevent such events like these in the future. Pass it to you.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And Bianca, if you want to talk about what you've seen in your own work at GreenRoots from extreme heat and the effects that you've observed.
Yeah, I think that Madeline gave a really great kind of scientific background, and appreciate that data as the background for people to think about while I talk about kind of the perspective that I can bring, which is on the ground effects of extreme heat. So as you were talking about and kind of showed, over the next couple of decades, we're going to have higher amounts of days of extreme heat. We're going to have kind of longer summers or longer months, periods of time where we have hotter months. And I think that what that looks like from a community perspective, especially in a community like Chelsea or East Boston that have low amounts of tree canopy and green spaces, is people are going to be experiencing more difficulty when being outside. So kind of what Madeline was talking about, people up here aren't really used to heat like they are in other places in the world. And I think that despite this being a high immigrant community in Chelsea, many people have lived here for 10, 15, 20 or more years. And, we have a really young population as well in Chelsea. So a really, really high amount of youth and kids, high schoolers, workers that are in the lower income brackets. So they're often doing more low income jobs in the area, including construction, working in kitchens, which is all really vital to the economy of the Boston area. And we see that as also an important reason why we want to maintain affordable housing in areas like this. But because of that, we also want to make sure that people are getting more access to shade and hydration and ways to cool down. And that's going to be even more important. Something that I'm seeing now is just people are starting to notice, in the summers when they don't have air conditioning. People, I think in New England, I'm not from New England, so I can kind of see from the outside that people have this idea of like, I can make it through the summer without air conditioning. I don't need it. And I think that's starting to change. People are saying, I actually really could use a window unit. And we saw at the very least, and then also what I bring also from the DC area is I'm like, I don't know that many people with window units where I'm from. Most people have central air conditioning because it's necessary. And if we're going to have a climate more similar to the Mid-Atlantic or, South Carolina or Georgia, which I also have family down there, people are going to need central air. And it's also often more environmentally friendly switching to systems that have central air for both heating and electrification purposes. So I think people are starting to notice that there's a difference in the summers, that they can't just make it through the few really, really hot days, especially people on third floors in the third floor walk-ups that are so common in Boston. And I think that people in Chelsea are also noticing things like, the neighborhoods that I work in Brookline and Arlington have a lot more shade and trees. And the neighborhood that I live in does not have shade when I'm walking to the bus. And it's harder for me to be outside and bring my kids outside. And I need places to be when it's hot, because even my home is too hot to be in. So definitely people are starting to take notice of the fact that there's less infrastructure for extreme heat.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll add that in cruise AC giveaways and distributions in the summer, giving a lot of people, like increasing numbers of people who are looking for window units and ACs that they could put in their home. But that is kind of a temporary step to making home, housing that's more insulated, that's more resilient to extreme heat, that can withstand both the winter and the summer, which as someone coming from outside Boston originally, I was dealing with both, and sometimes you forget that like not every city has the infrastructure and the housing supply that's really set up to deal with these challenges in the same way. But yeah, thank you both for sharing so much. Having seen both in your respective organizations, your work, there's different sides of how extreme heat have been affecting Boston and presenting itself. I'm curious about how the Sea Heat project, this sort of joint effort between GreenRoots Chelsea and Boston University and other community stakeholders first came together, how that began, and what the process was of that starting out. I'll let either of you jump in.
Well, I'll take that one because Bianca came in a year into the collaboration, and we're so glad that she did. But yeah, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I'm in a long-term relationship with GreenRoots, and we talk about research needs and public health concerns fairly regularly. And air quality has always been a concern, but we started thinking about heat and in the context of indoor air quality and ventilation, heating, cooling. GreenRoots does a lot of work on energy efficiency, microgrid project, energy self-sufficiency, self-determination. So talking about ways to do participatory action research in the city with a pretty diverse group of researchers here in my department, including Bowman, who's an engineer, and we're co-PIs of Sea Heat, and really built on all of our experiences to create this project. And it's had a research and an action component, which is fun for all of us, I think. I'll stop there.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. And with that project forming out of the existing relationship, and starting out to see heat as a target, as a danger, along with air quality, I'm interested if you could just talk for a bit to the audience about explain the Sea Heat project, what the goals of the project are, and yeah, like a lot of people here probably aren't as aware of it, and I'm sure people would be interested in knowing what it is you've been working on.
It's now a good time to share some slides, Madeline. Okay. Do you want to start out?
Oh, do you want me to share and you can talk?
Sure.
Okay. I'm not that coordinated. I'm working on it. Okay, here we go. I'm sharing. No, I'm not.
I think I might be able to put it up if you want.
While you're looking at the presentation, I see there's a question in the chat. Jane asks if the power outages are going to be more likely during extreme heat. And I can go ahead and answer from my perspective. Obviously, I don't know the future, but in general, I think most cities that deal with periods of extreme heat and heat waves, power outages are a lot more common in the summer when people are all in their homes running AC units running, cooling, trying to cool off. And so yeah, in general, there's definitely a correlation between extreme heat waves and power outages, because there's more like demand on the grid, there's more load going through, and just also more stress to infrastructure, more stress to power generators when there's temperatures above 90, above 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So I'll just start and kind of talk about the sea heat goals really quickly. So we're kind of in the second phase of the sea heat project. And the first part was kind of what we have up here on the screen. So we wanted to focus on building the capacity to respond to extreme heat events in both Chelsea and East Boston communities. So this involved both kind of multi-pronged approaches, right? So we wanted to gather data and understand the situation. So that's why we were focusing on putting up heat sensors throughout both cities and gaining localized heat data, because there's actually, some of the questions that we had, as Madeline described, developed between, GreenRoots community members and the researchers, and kind of really focusing on that perspective of, what does the community want to know is how are people experiencing heat in Chelsea and climate change, and what do we don't know what we don't know. So I think that gathering the localized heat data was something that we really wanted to start out with, and then, analyze that data. So gather the data, analyze, and simultaneously, while focusing on heat sensor data, also gather qualitative data by involving community members. And so by focusing on that, we had a part of the project that was called Photo Voice, which was a group of community members, both from Chelsea and East Boston, that took photos of their experiences with extreme heat and climate change throughout their communities, and through focus groups and conversations, created captions that were focused on action. So community action, a lot of the captions were geared towards decision makers, for example, as well as their fellow community members, kind of saying, here, this is what we're experiencing as as people that are primed to start noticing what it's like to have extreme heat in these communities. And so we could kind of combine both the data from heat sensors as well as those that qualitative information. So that was kind of really the goal, objectives, and outcomes almost of the project. And another kind of interesting outcome from gathering the heat data with the sensors was that ended up becoming part of an objective that we didn't even realize, was understanding the differences between localized heat data as well and kind of the National Weather Service station. So even just learning little things like localized heat data from these sensors were a lot more accurate and also very different than the National Weather Service, which is actually quite close. So the National Weather Service station that's recording all of our temperatures and kind of sending the data to our phones on our Apple weather apps and telling us what the heat looks like, what the temperature looks like for the day, was sometimes, I think it was 10 to 20 to 30 sometimes degrees difference between what our heat sensors were telling us. So that was a really important discovery that we made through this project. And definitely all of this information has helped us begin to build capacity to respond. So I think the first part of this project was definitely a lot of understanding what the situation is. And then the second part of the project for the next couple of years is, now that we have all of this information, what can we do with it? And how are we going to address the issues? So it's both focusing on policy changes. What can we suggest to decision makers? What do decision makers already know? What do community members know? And how much education do we need to do in order to have a community-based approach to responding to extreme heat? I'll move it to Madeline if you have anything to add.
Thanks. There was a question in the chat, or there is, about whether or not we measured air quality also. And I will say we did not in this study, but there are purple air monitors throughout the city that the Mass DEP has placed with GreenRoots input on where they should be placed. And we intend to, going forward, look at the, co-occurrence of heat and poor air quality. So looking at hot pockets. Yeah, we've just got the slideshow here. We can maybe show the photo voice. I think that's.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you just were speaking about that, so that'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
As you were speaking, Madeline, I was trying to find like a map of Chelsea with all of the sensors and stuff, but it wasn't working out super well. Yeah, so this is the photo voice. Some of the photos that we have from the materials that were generated out of the photo voice project. So on the left here, you can see we actually framed the photos and captions. Pilar, who I believe is actually on this call right now, so shout out to Pilar, was one of the team members who helped us realize this vision. As you can see, this picture is in Chelsea City Hall. So all of these photos and captions that are directly addressing the needs of the community were up in City Hall for over 2 months. So that was really great that we were able to put it up there because, decision makers and city manager, city council, everyone is walking through those calls on the daily. So, and able to better understand the experience of the residents that they represent. On the right is, on the top right is a picture from our opening of the City Hall gallery. And then the bottom right picture is from photo banners that we printed from all the photos and captions in both English and Spanish. And those banners were hung up throughout Chelsea and East Boston all summer this summer for community members to be able to see the work that their neighbors and other fellow community members did to document their experiences with climate change. And as you can see also in the photo, we have a little QR code that has a link to the photo voice report that has all of the photos in it, and a way to also share their own experiences. We had a Google form that people could use to add any experiences that they wanted to the project. So that was a really cool kind of final way of sharing all of the photo voice experiences. And I think we also still have all of these materials and they're still very relevant. All of these were only taken in 2020, I believe, or 2021 actually. So, I think I foresee this being a continuously usable, these are continuously usable engagement materials around climate change and extreme heat to continue the conversation within these communities. And so that was really helpful thing that I can, as a community organizer, that I can directly see as a outcome of this research project. And I feel like that's something really important to note is through having academic partnerships as a community-based organization. I think that's what sometimes we lose out on the most, which is definitely changing, but having that aspect of here's materials that, because of the data and because of the research, we can actually use to engage community and to communicate with people at a level that they understand instead of just having kind of really high level data. So that's just a fun note there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Go ahead, Madeline.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest you go to the prior slide. I think it has the link to the report, or the next one. Yeah, maybe it's the next one. There we go.
Yeah.
If people want to look at the report, all of the photos are there with all of the captions.
Yeah. And this is an example of we can also put the link to the report in the chat. But this is an example of what it looks like in the report, the photos and captions that you'll be able to see. So,
and that particular photo, sorry, that particular photo that you were just pointing to is illustrative of the lack of trees or, shade trees in a particular area of the city that land surface temperatures indicate are very hot based on those maps, and ambient temperatures also support that. So just to, for the research people in the house, we're comparing land surface temperatures with ambient monitors, and Yeah, so this is a hot spot and has led to a collaboration between GreenRoots and the city and the Boston Society of Landscape Architects to really cool it down with some innovations that we hope to monitor over the years.
Yeah. And as you can see on this street, I think that this also connects to what we were talking about in terms of seeing on the ground issues of what, you know, this changing climate is going to be bringing. Is even if we were to plant trees right now, which we have, I mean, Chelsea's part of the Department of Conservation and Recreation's state Gateway Cities program, which they're planting as many street trees as possible. But, you know, you're planting really small trees and that are going to grow. And if we're seeing changes over the next 10 years, a tree might not even be big enough to provide that much shade by then. So that's something else to think about. Is in the meantime, I know we had talked about, you know, window units versus longer term switching over to the electric grid and improving insulation and having central air. But that also kind of just reminds me that we kind of need all of those. We both need to provide people window units as much as possible. We need to plant small street trees that will end up being taller shade trees in, you know, 10, 15 years. But we also need the in-between solutions, like providing shade in other ways in the meantime. So that's kind of what Madeline, I think, was also starting to allude to, is we part of this Cool Block collaboration that we're working with the city. We are focusing on heat mitigation strategies that are in the real time. So planting plants on an empty lot, planting street trees, but also having some stormwater infrastructure, adding white roofs, adding shade in form of, you know, sail shades and tents that are going to be out during the summer on the blocks that we can get them on that are hotter based on surface Landsat data and ambient temperature data. So kind of all of the mitigation strategies at once is what we're working on. Cool Block.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all those, like that, all that information, that overview of what you've been working on. I'm really interested if, and I see there's actually some questions in the chat as well, we can get to either now or at the Q&A if we don't answer all of them now. But Tom's question asking, what are the obstacles for people who live in rental units? That also makes me curious, in addition to that, in general, what are some of the obstacles you've been running into, or what are you know, things you've found and observed with some of the problems you've been noting? I mean, the heat island effect and looking at where to plant trees is definitely one result of the project. I'm curious if there are other obstacles you found, other solutions that you've been identifying and looking at how to implement, if there's other things you're working on as well as part of the Z-Heat project.
I can start with that. So we are revisiting this issue of weatherization and cooling capacity at home for low-income renters. We have census tracts in the city that are 80 to 90% tenant occupied, often multifamily homes. The classic triple deckers, and yeah, as some of the photo voice illustrated, there's like a window unit like stacked up in almost every one of these buildings, and it costs electricity and it creates more pollution that increases the heat in a local area. So GreenRoots was involved with a weatherization campaign with Community Labor United and other organizations some years ago for heating, not cooling, but it's the same concept. It's the same insulation, essentially. And some of the barriers included like old knob and tube wiring and larger fixes than simply insulation to the whole infrastructure of the buildings. And landlords that didn't have the know-how or capacity or incentive to do any of this, and residents who felt that it would price them out of their own home by these upgrades. So we're revisiting this for what has changed policy-wise and resource-wise with the different programs available to low-income residents. There are quite a few, but I think they're not easily accessible, and some of those barriers really need to be addressed.
Yeah, and then I think other challenges from a community organizing perspective is certainly just convincing people in power that this is an issue that needs to be prioritized, and that it's connected to all of the other issues that that we're trying to address as a society, right? So it's sometimes is difficult to frame the need for trees and open space and green spaces that are also cooling spaces against things like the need for affordable housing. And often people kind of see those two as kind of going up against each other. I think that certain advocates for affordable housing are like, knock down trees, you know, if people need a place to live. And I think that we can be a lot more innovative and creative about kind of trying to do both at the same time. I think that there's many ways that they don't need to go up against each other. And then I think there's also just the challenges of dealing with any kinds of bureaucracy from, I'm sure that many people on this call have, if you're in any kind of environmental advocate, knowing how to make positive change while going up against people that just don't care that much or need to be convinced. So I think that those are just, from my perspective, those are also just the challenges is, you know, how do we use this data and how do we turn it out in an understandable format for people like city councilors or any other decision makers to really look at it and be like, okay, you know, this is an important issue, and you know, let me take suggestions on how to deal with it. So I know that was super general, but
no, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And on the topic of challenges, I will get to asking some more questions and get into more Q&A, but I do have one last question on the subject of challenges and think about how you turn sort of data and observation into action. I want to ask what the future looks like for the Sea Heat project and for your work. I'm curious what your next steps are, what you're working on like right now for the future, as well as more generally what you are looking forward to more broadly in the future.
Well, we're hoping to get more of the interventions available to people out there. Oh, thank you, Bianca. This is great. These are our objectives, I can tell you right now. For the cool block and other heat mitigation strategies we have implemented now, do our best to evaluate their efficacy. I should say the MBTA bus and T-stops, that's a work in progress. We were less clear on how that would happen, but have begun conversations with the MBTA on prioritizing stops that are particularly hot. As I mentioned earlier, assessing air quality hotspots, air quality meaning pollution and heat. And pilot workplace monitoring and interventions in partnership with MassCosh. So heat is a concern among many workers who are members of MassCosh and who participated in the Photo Voice project and are part of the Chelsea East Boston community, teachers, people who work in kitchens on construction sites. So there's a huge, I'll just say there's a huge gap in policies that protect people from extreme heat at both the workplace and at home. So short of a federal standard that would protect all workers in the workplace, indoor and outdoors, we need to figure out some creative solutions for the people we know are struggling here and now. And then the next slide. Just continues thinking about those solutions for protecting people from heat at home, including model ordinances, codes, and policies. boards of health in Massachusetts have a lot of potential to protect residents, as well as housing authorities. So we can get creative. Bianca, do you want to add to that? Anything?
Yeah, I think Madeline explained everything well, and I think to just continue building upon the work that we've already done, continue building upon the momentum that we have. We have a lot of residents really engaged now in at least the Cool Block and the Photo Voice project. So I think we can continue taking it a lot of places for education purposes. And there's a lot of ability to use all of this information. We created pretty easily readable data, visualizations around the heat. And I want to see that be used a lot more in communicating about climate change and things like zero carbon decarbonization and why that's important and how that's connected to climate change. So I think that that's something that's on my agenda for sure when communicating with residents.
Yeah, thanks so much for going into your work and going into the details of the project from now until 6, I think, and we can go maybe a little bit over, but I don't want that to take too much of your time. We'll open this up to having some questions. There's some questions in the chat already, and folks are free to either drop more questions in the chat or come off mute and ask those. How about we start with some of Tom's earlier questions that we didn't quite get to. You talked about the obstacles to people who live in rental units. He also asked the difference between insulating for heat and for cold, as well as if the project's looked at heat pumps. I can actually take the first part and say that the difference between insulating for heat and for cold, it's passive cooling is something that's been around for a very long time, like since for thousands of years, really. Like people have been building buildings and housing that can stay cool in the heat for a very long time. There's making more ventilation inside, having heat sinks, like a heat pump is a kind of a heat sink that absorbs heat from the building, but having other sort of interior spaces that absorb heat, as well as having a lot of interior airflow and ventilation, and then reduced airflow at the outside. Like if you think of, for a very specific example, which one comes to mind, if you think of like old ancient Roman houses, they all have courtyards. A lot of Greek, houses and places in Rome today still have big courtyards. And the reason is not just for, having a fountain or something, but because having big interior spaces that are open and then not much on the outside, not many windows on the outside, is really good for keeping buildings cold. There's a lot more principles of passive cooling, but that's an example of how people have been doing it for a very long time. Do you want to answer if there have been looking at heat pumps as part of the Sea Heat project?
Yes, I would like to answer no. Unless am I wrong? I don't know of any heat pumps. Yep. It's a good question. I wrote it down.
Yeah, I think that we at GreenRoots, we are definitely in conversation with like mass save programs and decarbonization and electrification programs, which usually involve setting up heat pumps and kind of doing a big, insulation heat pump renovation. There is definitely, I saw your question, Tom, there definitely is a challenge because there's so many rental units in Chelsea, and kind of getting the information out there that, even if you're a renter, you can have this done to your home. There is also certainly a bit of fear around causing gentrification if you do insulate a home and a landlord's like, oh, now it is a higher value, either the rent increase or kind of kicking out the current tenants for other tenants. I think that's definitely been a fear, which isn't necessarily always the case, but it's definitely a problem that people are worried about. So still working on, there are definitely a lot of people thinking about, how do we both change the the narrative on that, and also change the insulation and housing stock while we can, while also maintaining affordability. So, but it's certainly in conversation, and people in this sphere are aware of heat pumps and kind of the ability to better insulation for both cold and heat. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. Do you also want to, I'm also curious about Tom's second question about, do you think a lot of residents of Chelsea and East Boston know about heat island issues because of the project? Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. Like, I'm curious about how many folks you've been engaging with and reaching through the project, if you have kind of an idea of how many people might have gained awareness through this work.
More a question for me. Saw Madeline looking at me. So I think it depends on who. I would say we've probably engaged hundreds of people, in all different communities. So in Chelsea, there's, on the ground in terms of the cool block, I've put out hundreds and hundreds of flyers in the immediate neighborhoods. So just talking about the events that we have at the cool block, and and throughout the summer, we had almost weekly events. So had a lot of different residents show up to that. Talking about, I guess it depends on how you define engagement. At the cool block, there was an empty lot that has now been transformed into a park that is focused on cooling. So we added a lot of more lighter colors to a lot that used to just be asphalt and gravel. We added mulch and a swing set and, shade features and plants. So, and there's this lot that's now a park, happens to be right next to a bus stop, and, 30 to 40 kids flood the park every week now. So, in terms of engagement in a cooling space, that also, this park does have educational information throughout it about heat and why we are doing projects there. Definitely hundreds of residents. And then because of this project, we've also been on calls like this, but for many different organizations where we've been able to talk about the project. Because we've had the banners up in both Chelsea and East Boston in, parks that are used by a wide variety of communities. I think that we've luckily had a lot of opportunity to have a lot of outreach. So definitely in Chelsea and East Boston, and then through different organizations that are usually already focused on climate change and sustainability. We've gotten to talk about this project a lot, but can always use more. But I think we've been lucky in that we've been given a lot of platforms. I don't know if Madeline feels that way as well.
I was just going to say, yeah, events like this and media coverage by, NPR, WBUR, Fox News, like of various aspects of the work. So I don't know that it's related to our work, but people are concerned about heat, especially through the pandemic, with the, staying at home or standing in hot lines waiting for food. I think everybody was feeling it and wanted to do something about it.
Yeah, definitely. That definitely makes sense. I'm also curious about Elena's question about the policy response in the city of Chelsea. I know you talked about how it's now a DEP gateway city for the tree planting program. Have you seen other responses from local government or city government to this work and the data that you're putting together to sort of push them into action?
Yeah, I feel like both the cities of Boston and Chelsea are super on board with this work and partners, really. They want to find solutions. They would like the solutions to have some evidence of being effective, but they're investing in solutions that, just because they need to help residents and policies. That's my people I've talked to from outside of Massachusetts are like, where's the resistance to this work? And it's not with the local government.
That's encouraging to hear. I think we have time for one or two more questions. If anyone else has any questions they want to drop in the chat or come up mic and ask. I've been asking plenty of questions this whole time, so anyone who has any questions of their own is free to ask those.
I do see a question from someone that said, do you think, I think it was Tom also, do you think most of the residents of Chelsea and East Boston know about heat island issues that was as a result of our project? And I know we kind of already talked a little bit, I kind of already talked a little bit about engagement, but I think that I just wanted to emphasize the importance of, when gathering all of this data, putting it into really understandable formats. So even just really simple things like, what is heat index? Heat index being the kind of combination of temperature and humidity. So that's been some, like, our biggest focus is, how do we create materials that we can really give out to people that are understandable. And that's taken time, you know, synthesizing all of that data and saying, okay, what is most helpful? What do residents need to know? And realizing that, you know, there's going to be it's going to take a while to really get that out to people, that information. So that's kind of what I'm excited about with the Cool Block park now being up, is that we have a place where we can put up all of that information. But I think to your question, Tom, definitely a lot more residents could probably have access to educational materials around climate and heat, and, you know, more than just the general information of, you know, it was really hot this summer and I don't know what to do about it. You know, it's kind of getting people to think bigger picture, which is hard, understandably, because everyone's focused on, you know, day to day, how do I maintain, you know, how do I keep cool, and how do I make sure my family stays safe? So that's certainly something that we're still working on. And I think that people thinking about having as understandable information as possible, and not being too data sounding in communications, has been really important.
Yeah, thanks for adding out to that response too, and giving us some more context there. What might be the last question, actually, I think Tom asked another question about if you have an interest or any plans to do photo voice projects in other neighborhoods, to keep doing that or expand it. And then after that, I think that might be the last chance we have to answer questions.
I love photo voice. Yeah, I think we have an interest. And yeah.
Definitely. I think for me, I want to we had, I believe it was 12 residents that were the core group that were engaged in this photo voice project. I see photo voice as a way to really keep engaging people, even just in these neighborhoods. And, you know, that's what I've been kind of working on, and seeing how we can even continue adding to this particular project, is maybe having a blog that people submit photos to continuously as time goes on. And definitely we've had other people reach out to us in other neighborhoods around the Boston area and say, hey, this photo voice project's really cool. I'd love to know more about it and see if we can implement it. I think our eco youth, which are year-round youth organizers that we hire at GreenRoots, I think they're going to be participating in a photo voice project soon. So definitely think that we'll want to keep implementing it and spreading it to other organizations and people that are interested in doing this kind of engagement.
Awesome, thank you. I love to end on a high note. So that was a great answer to end this on. But yeah, thank you so much, Madeline and Bianca, for being able to be here and answering all those questions about the work that you're doing. It's really great to see like this approach to gathering data from the community, turning it into, you know, actionable advice and actionable information for city government, and that people have been receptive to it, that there is work being done to really address this growing problem. Yeah, really thanks for joining the two of you and everyone in our audience. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so that's the end of our program for tonight, and really appreciate having everyone here. Have a great rest of your evenings.
Thanks everyone for your questions and for being here. And thanks, Colin and Madeline.
Bye.